Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news analysis of the negotiations going on between Zelensky and Trump, Trump and Putin, European leaders as well. We had that arguably catastrophic meeting at the White House whereby it was reported by the Financial Times that there was lots of swearing and it was a very forthright meeting with Trump throwing maps around and not giving Ukraine tomahawks and essentially regurgitating Russian talking points. That came from European sources who knew about the meeting, but that has been contested somewhat, although there is some corroboration of it from some sources. Others are contesting it. There's an article in Politico, for example, that sort of claims a different angle, really, on that meeting. And so I want to go through that and then the responses to both the meetings that are still taking place and also the interviews that have taken place, or the pressers that have taken place involving Trump and some of Trump's statements over the last 24 hours, which have been really worthy of note. So let's get into this initially with Max Ceding here, saying Trump urged Zelensky to accept Russia's terms for ending its war in a volatile White House meeting on Friday, warning Putin said he would destroy Ukraine if it did not agree. The meeting was a shouting match with Trump cursing all the time. So that's what Max Ceding and the Financial Times team was saying. Here we have Tendar, German analyst, saying Russians repeatedly using Trump so that he coerces Ukraine to surrender the Donetsk region, which they have been desperately trying to get for years unsuccessfully, despite devoting their entire army and economy for this modest goal, is everything you need to know in determining how good things are on the ground for the Russian aggressors. So, you could read this as not looking great for the Russians because they have been so desperate to get hold of Donetsk. They've been unable to do so for so many years. They've got they've manipulated Trump to advocate on their behalf, really, in order to get Donetsk for the Russians, which is a kind of indication that they're unable to get it with regular military means. But however, I think the fact that, or the claim that, the idea that Trump is taking this appeasement route, or on the other hand, being an outright agent for the Russians, is deeply problematic for, well, I would say for Ukraine, for Europe. It's deeply problematic, I think, for the United States. Here is Max Ceding on the left here. We're not going to go, we know what he has said in that article. This is Aaron Burnett on CNN, and the chap on the right is a military analyst. And I think where he goes here, having spoken to Zelensky himself after the meeting, is pretty spot on.
It's a complete about face. I know you talked to Zelensky after the meeting. What did he say to you?
Well, Aaron, actually what was interesting is President Zelensky, after the meeting with President Trump, as he said to me and a few others, he also spoke to European leaders. So he was gauging their views as well. I think one of the biggest frustrations, frankly, for President Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, and the Europeans, as well as, I'm sure, a number of folks in the U.S. government, is it is not clear what the U.S. strategy is right now.
That's it.
There's just a lot of swinging back and forth about who's winning, what types of aid the U.S. is going to provide. It makes it very difficult to predict. So going into meetings in Budapest, it is not clear, again, what the U.S. positions are on any meaningful issue, because they're changing day to day, month to month, and week to week. And the Ukrainians had discussions with the U.S. about the Tomahawks, which would be useful for targeting Russian military assets beyond where the Ukrainians can target right now. And then the U.S. president got cold feet, concerned about escalation.
And that's the situation. So concerned about escalation, but probably, or almost certainly, prompted by that telephone call with Putin. Okay, so that's where we're at. We kind of know all this, but I thought it was interesting to note just the flip-flopping, the lack of strategy, and we talked about this previously, how there doesn't seem to be a coherent strategy that we can pin down that the United States really has. They're all over the shop with regard to Ukraine, and we could expand it further out from there. Now, Politico here has this article. Trump told Zelensky he had tried to end the war on the current line in the difficult White House meeting. Ukraine's leader left Washington without a promise of Tomahawk missiles from the US counterpart, but insiders blamed poor timing given events in the Middle East. Now, Politico here, at the time the Trump-Zelensky meeting took place, US officials warned Putin plans to keep fighting and aims to take all of Donbass. US officials warned that Putin was planning on doing that. Zelensky refused to cede any territory that's not occupied, of course, as you would expect. Trump closed with, let's try to end it along the current lines. Sources say the meeting wasn't bad, it was just mistimed. So there's a slightly different dynamic to that meeting, as according to Politico. And we've had a statement from the Europeans with Zelensky along these lines today, saying that actually we're happy with having a ceasefire along these current lines, and we'll start the negotiations from there. The Washington Post writes that Trump ignored Zelensky during their meeting and complained about not receiving a Nobel Peace Prize. So that's a further dimension to look at as well. Tim White excerpts this piece. He says, by the way, the Politico take today on the Trump-Zelensky meeting is a lot more believable than the, he says, discredited FT piece, which was published last night. So the quote from Politico here, and a quote within this, then US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff entered the conversation and said that the Russians aim to take the entire Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. And there was a feeling in the room that the Americans were testing the Ukrainians and what they would agree on, the person said. And I'm going to pause there to say this is an interesting position from Witkoff, which is not advocating on behalf. This is a really, really important. If this is true, if this statement is true, then the Americans are not advocating on behalf of Ukraine. They are trying to see what they can get as quickly as possible agreed, without caring whether it's beneficial for Ukraine or not. This is what Putin says. What are you going to say to that? Come on, agree. Okay, you're not agreeing to that. That's how I read this. There's a feeling in the room the Americans were testing the Ukrainians and what they would agree on. Because if the Ukrainians did say then, oh yeah, we'll give Russia all of Donbass, the Americans wouldn't put any pushback there. They'd be like, oh, brilliant, job done. Right, let's get that on paper. No kind of understanding, like, are you sure? Because that's giving away this and that, and I think you can push for this. There's no sense that the US is advocating on behalf of the Ukrainians here. That, I think, is a real political and moral shortcoming of the Trump administration. Anyway, to continue, giving up the well-fortified Donbass region is a no-go for Ukraine, which fears that doing so would open a clear route for Russia to take further territory more easily. It's not the first time that Trump administration has suggested land swapping that could favour Russian strategic aims, though the US president has more recently talked up Kiev's prospects in the war. So remember that Truth Social post where he said, I think Ukraine could win. Well, it appears that, and we're going to listen to a presser in a second, that has Trump essentially concluding the opposite to that, which makes you then, or it's more evidence to confirm, if you like, that Trump doesn't write his Truth Social posts. So he's got his own ideas in his head, and sometimes they align with what's stated on Truth Social, and sometimes they don't. And here we have a situation where someone with a clearer view of US foreign policy wrote that pro-Ukraine post, and Trump doesn't really agree with it. Quote, Zelensky did not agree that Ukraine had to give up land and Russia did not manage to occupy. In the end, Trump ended the meeting saying, okay, let's try to end this on the current line. The person mentioned, quoted above, said. In other words, it wasn't that the Americans were advocating for the entirety of the Donbass region to go to the Russians as the Russians were wanting, but actually just freeze it along the current lines. Okay, then you got the Washington Post writing that Trump ignored Zelensky during their peace meeting, complained about not receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Sorry, I wanted to bring some more of that Politico article in. So in a tense meeting, Trump told Zelensky to concede land and meet Putin's demands. Now, this Washington Post article does have some interesting nuggets in as well. It's more aligned to the Financial Times position, and it, in fact, kind of references the article, the FT article too, but has its own sources, but they might be the same sources. I don't know. Going down halfway down the article, it says a European official said Trump moved from talk of long-range missiles before the call to land swaps in his meeting with Zelensky. Quote, now he was saying the US needs Tomahawks and doesn't want to escalate. A European diplomat briefed on the White House exchange described it as a mess and said Trump also, quote, went on and on about, quote, his grievances of not having gotten the Nobel Peace Prize. Completely plausible that. I mean, he doesn't stop going on about that, right? It continues on the conflict. Quote, the message was that Russia only wants Donbass and this is a good deal, and Putin wants to end the war and it can be done quickly, the diplomat said. However, Trump emerged from the meeting with Zelensky calling for a ceasefire along the front line, a stance that the Ukrainian president has endorsed publicly, but the Kremlin has not. And that has actually been re-endorsed, as I say, today. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, responding to questions on Monday about freezing the conflict along existing front lines, said the issue, quote, has been raised repeatedly with various nuances during contacts between Russia and the US. He said that Russia's position remains unchanged. Putin told Trump during their call that Russian forces have, quote, the strategic initiative along the front lines, according to Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov. The Trump administration's shift quashed European hopes that Washington might come to Ukraine's rescue or boost its leverage in talks. It also piles fresh pressure on Kiev's chief backers in Europe to maintain the flow of cash and weapons. European diplomats have long suggested they acquiesced to the idea that Ukraine will have to concede land in any future US brokered settlement by freezing the front line, but they have backed Zelensky by insisting that Kiev not voluntarily cede any territory to Moscow that Russia does not control militarily. Okay, and before I go on to the next part, the situation here is that the US just wants a quick peace no matter what. Like, if Trump really does want the Nobel Peace Prize, he should, if on what has happened with the Ukraine war, he should not get it. He is advancing international aggression with every move in terms of Ukraine. Like, there's nothing that he's doing that is standing up for the victims here, that is standing up for the oppressed, for the invaded. He is making decisions and saying things more often than not that support the aggressors here. That should invalidate him from ever getting the Nobel Peace Prize. I think if Ukraine is forced into a suboptimal outcome for this war, it will be the fault of the present American administration. End of. It will be the fault of the Trump administration. The first person briefed on the meeting said it remained unclear what exactly had swayed Trump after the president had talked of Ukraine retaking its full territory and expressed frustration with Putin over stalled negotiations. Quote, he can flip back, you never know. The European diplomat, however, said it seemed that, quote, Putin knew what he was doing and got through to Trump. There are concerns among Europeans, once again, that things are backsliding, the diplomat said. For months, the Kremlin and European leaders have jostled for Trump's ear, adjusting to his policy changes on the war and his ambition for a peace deal. Trump's focus on the deal more than the details has at times left all sides frustrated, while the president has voiced irritation with both Kiev and Moscow throughout his efforts to stop the conflict. So on and so forth. Okay, so that's the Washington Post. We then have this statement that's come out today from all these top European leaders, Ursula von der Leyen from the EU, as well as Antonio Costa. You know, you got Starmer and Macron, Meloni, Merz, Tusk, Stubb, etc. And the statement reads as follows. We are all united in a desire for a just and lasting peace, deserved by the people of Ukraine. We strongly support President Trump's position that the fighting should stop immediately and that the current line of contact should be the starting point of negotiations. We remain committed to the principle that international borders must not be changed by force. Russia's stalling tactics have shown time and time again that Ukraine is the only party serious about peace. We can all see that Putin continues to choose violence and destruction. Therefore, we are clear that Ukraine must be in the strongest possible position before, during and after any ceasefire. We must ramp up the pressure on Russia's economy and its defense industry until Putin is ready to make peace. We are developing measures to use the full value of Russia's immobilized sovereign assets so that Ukraine has the resource it needs. resources it needs. Leaders will meet later this week in the European Council and in the coalition of the winning format to discuss how to take this work forward and to further support Ukraine. Okay, so you can read this in a number of ways. Some people, like here below, say this is really awful and weak. I would say you could read it like that. You definitely could read it as them not supporting Ukraine as much as possible, that they are saying, yep, you can draw the lines in the sand where the present front lines are and then start negotiations from there. But this is probably coming from Ukraine, right? This will be with the agreement of Ukraine. In other words, this is a statement with Ukraine, joint statement on Ukraine. But this is a statement from Zelensky as well, right? He's not been coerced into this, or at least he hasn't been by the Europeans. The Europeans, and the Washington Post article goes at lengths to talk about this, say very clearly that we don't want to force Zelensky to do anything that he doesn't want to do. This is for him and the Ukrainian people to decide. And so if Zelensky's deciding we can freeze the current front lines and negotiate from there, then that tells us a couple of things, I think. The big takeaway from this is I think Ukraine is in a really weak position at the moment, and they are worried about losing more territory, and they're worried about the winter strikes that are going to absolutely cripple Ukraine. And if they aren't going to receive Tomahawks and they aren't going to get an absolute ton of weaponry right now that only the US can supply, I think, in any meaningful quantities, then they're in trouble. The US is not interested in massively sanctioning Russia at the moment. Even if the Blumenthal and Lindsay bill goes through, where they have 85 senators supporting that, it's likely to get through Congress. The bill actually gives the president the exclusive power to enact the bill. In other words, it's still reliant on Trump to put sanctions on Russia. And he is clearly not willing to do that. He's clearly in the hands of the Russians here. So what can everyone else do? Well, the Europeans can keep supporting Ukraine with as much money and military equipment as possible, but Ukraine is struggling to get people on the ground, boots on the ground to the front line. They are struggling economically, and they're struggling on the front lines as the Russians are grinding on and making these gains. It is coming at inordinate cost to the Russians, but that's very relevant for future calculations of how long this can go on. But for right now, it's probably the case that the Ukrainians are teetering at the moment. They're finding it really difficult. These strikes and the increase in the numbers of Shaheds and missiles that the Russians are sending and the lowering of the interception rates is a real challenge. So their energy industry is infrastructure is getting absolutely hammered. The Russians are still just about managing to recruit enough people to have active front lines. And every bit of territory that Ukrainians grind back comes at a cost to the Ukrainians. It comes at a greater cost to the Russians, but it is an unsustainable way of making ground. Like militarily, the Ukrainians are not going to take their territory back that they have lost. I know some people think that is still the case. They just don't have the people to do that. The Russians are militarily making ground, but they because they can afford to lose that many people. The Ukrainians can't afford to lose that many people, but that's how many people it would take. And we hear today the prevalence of drones. Just moving anyone on the front line is becoming more and more challenging. And so that means the front lines will become more and more static. I've said for some time now that the way that Ukraine wins militarily, if they are going to win militarily, it is contingent upon a financial and economic collapse of Russia, which I think is fairly close. And what's frustrating here is that if the US got on board with Ukraine on January the 21st and went hard at Russia's economy, I think their economy would have properly collapsed by now, or been in an even worse state than it is now. And that would be putting inordinate amounts of pressure on Russia to come to the negotiating table. And I think if the US had given the military support to Ukraine that they should and could have done, then Ukraine could have held more land militarily. They would have had Tomahawks, they would have had this, they would have had that. I just think the US held the cards here, and they stole some cards from the Ukrainians, and they kept some cards from themselves, and it really is very frustrating. So I think this is, I think, a recognition that Ukraine is in a tough situation, but it's also not taking it away from Ukraine. It's not dictating anything to Ukraine. But then there's another dimension that we need to consider. So Peskov has already said, we've had these claims of ceasefires before, and he's dismissed it. And you've had Lavrov come out and say the following, and I'm going to read you through this. So I'm going to turn him off though. I want to officially confirm that Russia has not changed its position compared to the understandings, he says, reached during the extensive negotiations between Putin and Trump in Alaska. So in other words, we haven't changed our mind. Nothing's changed since Alaska. So we're still happy to keep on fighting. Thank you very much. He continues, these understandings were based on the agreements achieved at that time, which Trump succinctly summarized when he said that what is needed is a long-term and sustainable peace, not an immediate ceasefire, which would lead nowhere. In other words, no ceasefire now either. We haven't changed our position from Alaska, and we said then we don't want a ceasefire, that we need a long-term and sustainable peace. In order to do that, we need to achieve the goals that we set out to achieve. That's how you get sustainable peace as far as the Russians are concerned. Anyway, Lavrov himself continues, we remain fully committed to this formula, and I confirmed it yesterday in a conversation with Marco Rubio. Therefore, when statements now come from Washington saying that there must be an immediate halt, that nothing more should be discussed, and that history should judge afterward, simply stopping would mean ignoring the root causes of the conflict. Of course, we know what that means. Root causes of the conflict are, the Ukraine Nazis. We need to denazify Ukraine, get rid of the present government. We need to demilitarize Ukraine. They need to cut down the size of their army, and we need to, all these things that are never going to happen. So this will not happen. So this is the Russians saying that we remain intransigent. We are not going to move on our off our present course. And I've said that to Marco Rubio. So then it goes back to what Trump has tried to sort out. This should lead Trump to just go, right, screw it. Well, I'm not having a meeting with Putin. You guys are being a bunch of sods. We're going to support Ukraine to the hilt. That's what he should say now, is what he should have said 7 months ago, because this is entirely predictable. Like, Trump is either just completely and utterly naive and in awe of Putin and Imperial Russia, or he's actively an agent, or both. Which the American administration, continues Lavrov, clearly understood and acknowledged when Donald Trump came to power. Okay, so the Russians are very clearly saying that they are not going to change course here. Now, let's go back to what the Europeans and Zelensky said. Now, if the Europeans and Zelensky knew that this was the case, and I think Peskov had already said what he had said there, and possibly Lavrov had already said this, I'm not 100% sure though. It might not have done, it might have been, that was this morning. Then you could also read this position from the Europeans in another way, which is, here Zelensky is saying, I am willing, Ukraine is willing to do whatever the US has asked. And yet again, as you can hear from Peskov, and as you can hear from Lavrov, yet again, the Russians are not willing to play ball. So Donald Trump, here you have it as clear as day that the only one stopping this negotiation from taking place satisfactorily, the only ones are the Russians. And you need to do something about that right now. Because all you keep doing is saying there will be consequences if nothing happens, there will be consequences if nothing happens. And every time we get to this point where nothing happens, and it's explicitly the case where nothing happens, but actually Ukraine have said that they are willing to do anything here. And yet nothing happens. This is the Russians' fault, and it should be obvious that it is the Russians' fault. As and I'm gonna sort of jump around a little bit here. So we have Radoslaw Sikorski here, the foreign minister for Poland, saying we cannot guarantee Putin's plane. Oh no, actually, I want to come to that a little bit later. I thought that was going to be, it was Tusk saying that we are not, so Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, saying we are not going to, in kind of repudiating Trump's position, we are not going to force Ukraine to give up territory. So there's that support from the Europeans. Now, we have Tim White here saying, some have noted how Budapest stinks as a venue for the Putin-Trump meeting, which could see the final betrayal of Ukraine by the USA, 31 years after Clinton guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty in the same city. When the time came to honour our word, Barack Obama and the UK failed. So this is a Budapest memorandum that famously failed, right? Although I think sometimes it's kind of misinterpreted. The Budapest memorandum was a nuclear agreement in terms of nuclear security, and actually I used to think that we have failed in the Budapest memorandum, but technically we haven't. Actually, technically, the Budapest memorandum has not. If you read it, and I've read it to you several times now, to show that actually it's only kind of enforced when there is a nuclear threat from any country, whereas that hasn't happened yet. So, but nonetheless, the Budapest memorandum has a position in the public psyche concerning, a failure to support Ukraine. I mean, the worst thing about the Budapest memorandum was taking Ukraine's nuclear missiles away and strategic bombers. And had that not happened, Ukraine probably wouldn't have been invaded now. So that's really the issue there, is denuding them of their best deterrence. But Putin loves humiliating symbolism, says Tim White. Look at the date on the Budapest memo. It was signed on the 5th of December. The Russian leader just didn't expect Trump to fold so quickly, so now he's ordering Lavrov and co. to invent reasons to delay the meeting a little. Look at CNN's headline. So Tim White is saying that this meeting then in Budapest, which is going to take place supposedly between Putin and Trump, might well have happened too quickly. Trump just gave in too quickly. Little did Putin expect. He was like, oh my goodness, this is easy, and we're not going to quite get a signing on the 5th of December, which would be lovely and symbolic. However, CNN is reporting that Putin and the Trump and Putin meeting may be postponed. As it says here, Trump's hope for a quick second summit with Putin may be stalled as a pre-meeting tabled for now. I presume that's the American version of tabled, meaning it's taken off the table, whereas in the UK we understand that as when you table a bill, you put the bill to the people, whereas in the US I think it means the opposite. So so the meeting being tabled I think means it's been postponed. So after a phone conversation between Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov on Monday, American officials concluded that Russia's position has hardly changed during the meeting during this time, and remains within its initial maximalist demands regarding the war in Ukraine. In other words, nothing has been achieved in terms of supporting, in terms of, well, really, Ukraine getting any benefit and Russia being put under any pressure, or Russia wanting to come to the negotiating table. So next, the reports that Lavrov-Rubio talks collapse. A planned meeting between US Secretary of State Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, meant to lay the groundwork for a Putin-Trump meeting, has been postponed. CNN reports, citing a White House source. No official reason was given, but according to CNN, the two sides sharply disagreed on how the war could end. After a recent phone call between Lavrov and Rubio, Washington concluded that Moscow hadn't moved away from its unrealistic demands. CNN notes that Rubio is unlikely to support holding the Putin-Trump summit next week in Budapest. In other words, I think the Russians think that they could actually gain on the battlefield significantly. I honestly think that Putin is being fed inaccurate information, and we're at a point where he thinks that Ukraine could capitulate. However, there are elements of stresses, strains and cracks in the Ukrainian defense. We've got Pokrovsk in all sorts of trouble, but we've also got, I think, the energy infrastructure being weakened on a nightly basis. But then we hear that Trump is now blocking the G7 plan to use Russia's frozen assets. According to Bloomberg, the EU initiative hoped to secure loans to Ukraine for up to $160 billion. And now, no wonder it was a 2.5-hour phone call between Putin and Trump, because Putin had so many instructions to give. This is not looking good, and it also just shows that Trump is in full-on Russian appeasement mode. The US has refused to support the Big Seven plan to transfer 140 billion euros in frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. Trump is no longer hiding his betrayal of Ukraine and thus Europe, says Jürgen Naudit. With the headline here, US is stalling on a G7 plan to expand use of Russian assets. John Cleese is getting involved. I love John Cleese at the moment. He's the former Monty Python comic, saying Trump is quite clearly a Russian asset. Any lingering doubts have been laid to rest in the last week. He is embracing a country that has been America's enemy since 1945. Many people are now really just very obviously and overtly saying that Donald Trump is a Russian asset. Nothing else explains it nearly so well. We're going to go now to hear Mark Kelly, who was in the running to be the VP under Kamala Harris. Tim Walz was selected instead, but he is a state senator for Arizona and very well regarded former Navy pilot and astronaut.
So I spoke to Zelensky 3 weeks ago in New York right after his meeting with Donald Trump, and we talked about Tomahawks in that meeting. Much longer range, over 1,000 miles, 700-pound warhead. It's really good, game-changing. The president said he would consider giving them this weapon system. And then he had a conversation with Vladimir Putin. And I think it's important for people to recognize Vladimir Putin is a former KGB officer. He is a master manipulator. The president has one view, then he talks to Vladimir Putin, and he changes his story on this. Of course, Putin does not want Ukraine to get a longer range missile that could go after targets deep into Russia, beyond Moscow and St. Petersburg, by the way. It can range targets much further. It's very accurate. It's a very survivable weapon. And Putin has a conversation with him, and those weapons are now off the table. Hey, I think Ukraine can handle. So I spoke.
Yes, that needs to be discussed on national television an awful lot more. I think we need Republicans to come up with a reason why Trump's position changes merely after a phone call with Putin. It is clear that Putin is a master manipulator and Trump is easy to manipulate. It's that simple. And then, when we talk about Budapest, so the place of this meeting between Trump and Putin, the Huffington Post reached out to Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, and they say, is the president aware of the significance of Budapest? In 1994, Russia promised in Budapest not to invade Ukraine if it gave up the nuclear weapons it inherited when the Soviet Union dissolved. Does he not see why Ukraine might object to that site? Who suggested Budapest? Thanks. So this is a question from the Huffington Post journalist on a back channel to Caroline Leavitt. And this is what Caroline Leavitt says. Who suggested Budapest? She said, your mum did. That's the seriousness that the US administration is taking this war. That is the press secretary for the White House, for the President of the United States of America. That is disgusting. And rightly, the Huffington Post journalist says, is this funny to you? And she says, it's funny to me that you actually consider yourself a journalist. You are a far left hack who nobody takes seriously, including your colleagues in the media. They just don't tell you that to your face. Stop texting me your disingenuous, biased and bullshit questions. What is disingenuous, biased or BS about that question? That is an absolutely bona fide, well thought through question that Trump needs to answer. And to give the answer of your mum did. You're not at fricking school. People are dying every single day in this war. Civilians, children, soldiers. We need to get this right, yeah? Caroline Leavitt is a freaking disgrace. Jake Bro brought up this tie. it was then his tweet was on Russian television. He tweeted about that. He posted about that today, Jake Pro, and he was like, "Yeah, that's another check on the bucket list." Huffington Post asked why Pete Hegseth wore a tie that looked like the Russian flag. The Pentagon's spokesman, Sean Parnell, replied, "Your mum bought it for him, and it's a patriotic American tie, moron." Sean Parnell is taking a leaf out of the Caroline Leavitt book here. Let's ask a serious question about something that looks dodgy. Oh, right. Your answer is your mum bought it for him. Okay, brilliant. I just thought, since we're involved in what I think is a world war, since this is in effect World War III, I thought we could take some of these things seriously. But no, we're apparently on a freaking playground at primary school. I am utterly disgusted in these people. Talking about disgusted, let's then go to Donald Trump, who gives us an opinion that is in complete contradiction to what he said on Truth Social when he was at the UN assembly.
Just a few weeks ago at UNGA, you said that Ukraine could possibly win the war and keep its territory, but now the story seems a bit different.
They will, but they could still win it.
So now he's playing around the idea of could, these kind of modality, the modal inference there, or the meaning really. Yeah, they could win it. Yeah, they could win it. Yeah, but the way you were saying it before, you were like, Russia's on its knees economically. They could win this thing. Go and buy our weapons, support the European Union. You can go and win this. And now they're saying, yeah, well, they could. They like conceptually they could, but I don't think they're going to. So now you've got Donald Trump coming out and publicly saying he doesn't think Ukraine can win this war. Now, I actually don't think that as an analyst, but then I'm also careful to say, well, look, we need to think about what winning means here. I don't, we can talk about who won World War II, well, the Allies, but in terms of did France win? No, I mean, they lost out. It took decades and decades to get back to kind of where they were. Like Europe, everyone lost. You could argue the US won. And so I've seen someone say recently, it might be on one of my threads, that arguably the US won World War II in terms of getting more out of the whole thing than they kind of put in terms of that balance. And you could argue even Russia, although Russia lost 26 million people, they got more territory, right? So if that's your way of winning, they came back from World War II with more territory. They started with that kind of thing. But reality here is my position is that neither side wins. But this is a nuanced conversation where we sit down and we have a technical analysis here. The President of the United States is not doing that. He's like, yeah, I don't think they're going to win, which is to basically diss on Ukraine. What he doesn't then say is, but I don't think Russia's going to win either. No one wins here. He doesn't say that. He just says Ukraine. I don't think Ukraine are going to win, which is, I think, therefore disingenuous or irresponsible, or both.
They could still win it. I don't think they will, but they could still win it. I never said they would win it. I said they could win. Anything can happen. War is a very strange thing. A lot of bad things happen. A lot of good things happen. If you look at the Middle East, I would say prior to us hitting Iran so hard, we could have never made that deal, because you would have had a dark cloud over the Middle East where we took out their nuclear capability, which was one of the great military maneuvers of all.
Okay, then he moves on to saying how wonderful he is and the stuff he's done. You got Albo there, Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, giving a furrowed brow, which I think is probably the correct response there. Here we got Trump again here.
And you have within your power, you're the most powerful man on earth. Why don't you just enable Ukraine to finish this war tomorrow?
Yes, yes, yes. You're the most powerful man in the world now. Why don't you enable Ukraine to finish this thing tomorrow? 100%. Thank you. Best question I've heard in the last month.
Well, if you knew anything about what you were talking about, you'd be able. You do? I don't think you do, really.
And this is where Donald Trump is just a despicable human being. Like, he's so rude. How do you know what she knows? How do you I don't think you know what you're talking about. How do you know that? I would ask that same question to you. And do you know what? Compared to you, Donald Trump, on this subject, I know a feck ton more than you do. You are wholly ignorant. Just like I've read a dozen books on this topic over the last 3.5 years. How many books have you read on this topic? You know, but I will go down that route. Like, how many articles have you read on written on this topic and read on this topic? I've written articles. I've read books. I have interviewed people. I've been to Ukraine twice. I have spent thousands of hours researching this. Thousands of hours. I know more than you, and I would have asked that question myself. So how dare you say that to her?
Just enable Ukraine to finish this war tomorrow.
Well, if you knew anything about what you were talking about, you'd be able. You do. I don't think you do, really. I don't think you do, because it's a little more complicated than that. But it sounds easy. We're in the process of trying to make a deal. If we make a deal, that's great. If we don't make a deal, it'll be. A lot of people are going to be paying a big price.
Which is what he said 7 months ago, right? So if we're trying to make a deal, but if we don't make a deal, yeah, but that's what he said like 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks before that, 2 weeks before that, 2 weeks before that, 2 months before that, 7 months ago. Yeah. When is if we don't make a deal, when is the timeline there? Like, well, you haven't made a deal, and Lavrov and Peskov are saying you ain't going to make a deal that looks like the one that you think is going to look like. So when do you then follow through on what you're saying? It's just really, really frustrating.
A little more complicated than that, but it sounds easy. We're in the process of trying to make a deal. If we make a deal, that's great. If we don't make a deal, it'll be a lot of people are going to be paying a big price.
Yeah, and but the beginning part of that question, by the way, was, would you support Senator Lindsey Graham's bill to declare Russia a terrorist state? And you have within your power the most powerful man on earth. Why don't you just enable blah, blah, blah? So actually, that Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal bill also does need to be brought forward and voted on. But yeah, it is, I think, just indicative of Trump's whole persona, that exchange. We're abandoning our allies in Ukraine, says Republicans for Ukraine, and making clear we will not stand up to China if and when they invade Taiwan. This is unprecedented American weakness on the global stage. So you got another question here that I think is that is related to the topic and worth exploring.
There are reports that you will come up, or China is pressuring you to not support independence for Taiwan in exchange for a trade deal.
Well, I'm not going to talk about that. What I'll talk about...
So the question is, there are reports that China is pressuring you to not support independence for Taiwan in exchange for a trade deal. And he says, well, I'm not going to talk about that.
You and I will have that discussion in a couple of weeks when I'm in South Korea with President Xi. We're going to be talking about a lot of things. I assume that's going to be one of the things, but I'm not.
He's not going to talk about that. But yeah, because actually Donald Trump would prefer to do a trade deal. He couldn't give two hoots about Taiwan. He would want to do a trade deal that sells Taiwan down the river, onshores manufacturing of microchips, and leaves Taiwan to the fate of China. No problem there for Donald Trump. Now, Bulgaria apparently is ready to allow Putin's plane to pass through its airspace for a meeting with Trump in Budapest, according to the country's foreign minister Georgiev. Poland has warned that Putin's flight to Hungary for Trump talks could be diverted to The Hague. Quote, I cannot guarantee that an independent Polish court won't order the government to escort such an aircraft down to hand Putin over to the court in The Hague, said Sikorsky. Wow. We cannot guarantee Putin's plane won't be forced to land for his arrest if he enters Polish airspace. So that is a very different approach from what we heard from Bulgaria. So there could be some arguments concerning that going forward. And then, so we have been over what CNN has said. We are going to finish with this. This is Euromaidan Press's synopsis of events. Putin knows exactly how to get Trump to change his mind on Ukraine, and he's getting pretty good at it. Stefan Wolf, a professor of international security, traces how a single Putin call on 16th of October killed a long-range missile deal that seemed nearly complete. Before that, Trump had been frustrated with the stalemate and was discussing Tomahawk deliveries with Zelensky. He even declared that Kiev was, quote, in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. In a position to is slightly stronger than they conceptually could, which is kind of where he was going in the last presser that we were listening to. But then, of course, I don't think he actually wrote that Truth Social post, so it might not reflect his inner beliefs. But Putin's call, mixing warnings about damaged US-Russia relations with praise for Trump's Middle Eastern efforts and a Budapest summit offer, reversed that approach. Hours later, Trump told Zelensky the weapons were a big deal for the US, needed to keep them, and urged both sides to make a deal. Wolf's analysis shows this pattern is not isolated. The Kremlin appears to have developed a reliable playbook for blocking military aid through personal diplomacy with Trump. In other words, what we appear to be seeing is every time Zelensky gets the upper hand, Putin gives Trump a phone call. And the question, yet again, is he just a useful idiot that is easy to manipulate, or is there absolutely compromise on Trump? Is he an agent in some way, more like a witting agent than an unwitting agent for Russia? And those conversations will rumble on, no doubt, for many years to come. Anyway, that's enough from me. It's quite a big one today because there is an awful lot to talk through and some nuances there as well. Let me know what you think as ever. Take care and I'll speak to you soon.